Captain Ethan Ward paced restlessly inside the cramped shuttle cabin, his mind preoccupied with a mission that had started to feel more like a diplomatic formality than a real assignment. He was a soldier, not a guest at a royal wedding, but this invitation wasn't something he could ignore. Earth had been making diplomatic strides with the Zervani, an advanced alien civilization, and his presence at their royal wedding was a show of goodwill. He had no choice but to go. "Just get through the ceremony and it'll be over," Ethan muttered to himself, staring out the window at the stars. The shuttle hummed steadily as it made its way toward the Zorvani capital, a sprawling metropolis filled with towering structures that looked like something out of a dream. The planet, lush with vibrant alien flora and bathed in two suns, would be a spectacular sight, but he couldn't bring himself to care. He'd seen plenty of beautiful worlds, and none of them had ever mattered more than the one he was trying to protect. His mind drifted back to the day's briefing. The wedding was supposed to be between the Prince of Zorvani, a charismatic young ruler named Prince Kalen, and Lady Elira, a member of one of the planet's most influential families. The wedding was to cement an alliance, one that would help stabilize the political climate. Everyone in attendance was expected to keep up appearances, and Ethan had no problem with that. He had seen his fair share of grand ceremonies, and he wasn't one to stand out. But when the shuttle finally touched down on Zorvani soil, Ethan immediately sensed something was off. The grand hall where the wedding was being held looked far too extravagant for a simple exchange of vows. The air hummed with tension, as if everyone involved knew that something important was happening, but not everything was as it seemed. As Ethan stepped into the hall, he was struck by the stunning alien architecture. The walls were a mixture of translucent materials that shimmered with the glow of bioluminescent plants, while the ceiling was an elaborate mosaic of stars and swirling nebulae. He had never seen anything like it, and the guests, aliens of all shapes, sizes, and colors, seemed to blend seamlessly into this world. Yet even in the midst of such opulence, there was an undercurrent of something darker, something that hinted at trouble to come. The ceremony began without incident, the exchange of vows and rings proceeding in the traditional Zorvani style, yet Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that he was merely a spectator in a far larger play. As he glanced around the room, he noticed the princess, Princess Zara, the king's daughter, stood in the corner of the room, her presence commanding yet strangely withdrawn. Her beauty was ethereal, with dark, almost otherworldly features, and her eyes, a striking shade of violet, seemed to hold a depth of knowledge that belied her age. She wasn't smiling. She wasn't even looking at the ceremony. Instead, she stared out into the distance, her mind seemingly miles away from the festivities. Curiosity gripped Ethan. He was used to seeing alien royalty in their element, surrounded by attendants and court members. But Zara was different. She didn't belong to the spotlight like the others. She stood alone, almost like she was hiding from the world, as if something had made her retreat from the life she was expected to lead. And it was that very isolation that drew Ethan to her. He made his way through the crowd, not sure why he felt compelled to approach her. As he got closer, she turned, catching his eye. For a moment, neither of them spoke. There was an unspoken understanding, a quiet recognition between them, as if they had both stumbled into a situation they didn't quite know how to handle. "It's a beautiful ceremony," Ethan said softly, offering her a polite smile. Zara's gaze softened, though her face remained impassive. "Yes," she replied, her voice smooth, almost melodic. But beauty can often mask the truth. Her words lingered in the air, their meaning unclear. Ethan couldn't help but feel like she was talking about more than just the wedding. Her gaze seemed to hold a weight, as though she knew something he didn't, something that would soon come to light. Before he could respond, the ceremony took a dramatic turn. An explosion shook the room, followed by the sound of blaster fire. Panic spread like wildfire through the hall as the Zorvani royal guard scrambled to protect the royal family. Ethan immediately moved to action, his instincts kicking in. He grabbed Zara's arm, pulling her toward a nearby exit as chaos erupted around them. His training kicked in, and he moved swiftly, scanning the room for threats. The air was thick with the smell of smoke and the sounds of distant explosions.
"Stay close," he ordered, leading her through the crowd. But Zara didn't need telling twice.
She moved with a grace that seemed to defy the chaos, her eyes sharp and alert. Despite the violence surrounding them, Ethan couldn't help but notice how calm she remained. "Who's attacking?" he asked, as they ran through the hallways, the sounds of battle echoing in the distance. "It's the rebels," Zara answered, her voice steady despite the panic. "They've been planning this for years. They want to overthrow my father's reign."
Ethan's heart skipped a beat.
He had known that political unrest had been brewing on Zorvani, but he hadn't realized it was this serious. The royal wedding had been a facade, a carefully orchestrated event to lure the rebels into the open. And now the royal family was under siege. "We need to get you to safety," Ethan said, his mind racing. But Zara shook her head, her eyes burning with determination. "No. We need to end this now," she said, her voice fierce. Before Ethan could protest, another explosion rocked the building, shaking the walls. The force sent them both stumbling. When Ethan regained his footing, he looked at Zara, only to find her already drawing a weapon from beneath her gown. "Zara, no, this isn't your fight," he warned, but she ignored him, her face set in a determined frown. "This is my fight," she said simply. "It's time for me to take control." At that moment, they were interrupted by the arrival of royal guards, who had been assigned to protect the princess. But Zara didn't hesitate. She stepped forward, her voice strong as she addressed the captain of the guards. "Take me to my father," she commanded. Ethan stood in the background, watching as the guards reluctantly obeyed. His mind was still spinning from everything that had happened so suddenly. He had come to the wedding expecting a simple, dignified ceremony. Now he was in the middle of a political crisis, protecting a princess with a secret he didn't fully understand. As they moved through the corridors, the sounds of battle faded, replaced by the quiet hum of emergency alarms. Ethan could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on him. Zara wasn't just any princess. She was a pawn in a much larger game, and her life had been placed in his hands. Just as they neared the royal chambers, the king's voice boomed through the intercom. "Zara!" the king's voice echoed. "Where are you?"
"You're in danger. We must act quickly."
Zara didn't flinch. Instead, she walked toward the door, her face steely. "I'm ready, father," she said, the weight of her words hanging in the air. Ethan couldn't help but wonder what lay ahead. The rebellion had just begun, and the stakes were higher than he ever could have imagined. And then, as if it was part of the plan all along, the king made an announcement that would change Ethan's life. Forever. "You will marry Zara," the king declared. "The only way to secure our future, to ensure our family's safety, is for you to marry the human, Ethan Ward. He will be your protector, your husband. Together, you will rule." Ethan's breath caught in his throat. He couldn't believe what he was hearing. A wedding? Now, in the middle of a political uprising? And not just any wedding. This was a royal order. Before he could speak, Zara turned to him, her gaze steady and unwavering.
"Will you protect me?" she asked, her voice low. Ethan nodded, unsure of what he had just agreed to.
But as they stood there, in the midst of the chaos, he knew one thing for certain. His life would never be the same again. Captain Ethan Ward's mind raced as he stared at the royal guards surrounding him and Princess Zara. The words spoken by the king echoed in his head. "You will marry Zara." It was a command, an order he couldn't refuse. His gaze flicked to Zara, who stood beside him with a calm and composed expression on her face. She didn't seem surprised by her father's words. as if this was a decision already made long before he had arrived at the wedding. Ethan swallowed hard, trying to make sense of the situation. He had been sent to this planet as part of a diplomatic mission, not to become embroiled in royal politics, let alone marry a princess. But now, there was no escaping it. The Zorvani rebels had attacked the wedding, and the royal family was under threat. The king had made his decision. Zara's marriage to him was the only way to secure her safety and the future of the kingdom. The reality of the situation hit Ethan all at once. He was a soldier, trained for combat, not for courtly duties. He wasn't equipped to be a prince or a husband to a royal. Yet, here he was, standing in the midst of a political crisis with Zara, an alien princess, as his unwilling bride. "You're sure about this?" Ethan asked softly, his voice filled with uncertainty. They had only known each other for a few hours, and already he was being thrust into a role that was both foreign and terrifying. He had no idea what Zara thought of him, or what her life had been like before this moment. Zara turned to him, her expression unreadable. "I didn't ask for this, but sometimes duty requires sacrifices."
We don't have a choice anymore. The rebels won't stop until my father is dethroned, and I'm not willing to stand by and let that happen.
Ethan nodded slowly. He understood the weight of responsibility, the pressure to protect those who couldn't protect themselves. But this was more than just a duty. This was a marriage, a lifelong commitment, and he wasn't sure he was ready for that. "We'll get through this," he said, more to himself than to her. "We have to." With the royal guards leading the way, they moved quickly through the corridors of the palace, which had become a maze of chaos since the rebel attack. The hallways were eerily quiet, the sounds of distant fighting muffled by the thick stone walls. The once grand palace now felt like a fortress under siege, and every step they took seemed to bring them closer to danger. The princess remained composed, her eyes fixed ahead, but Ethan could see the faintest tension in her shoulders. She was hiding something. He could feel it. Her calm demeanor was just a mask, and underneath, there was fear. A fear of what might happen next. A fear of losing everything she had ever known. As they moved deeper into the palace, they came to a set of heavy, reinforced doors. The guards exchanged brief words with each other before opening the doors to reveal a small, private chamber. It was dimly lit, with only a few candles flickering in the corners of the room. The king, his face drawn with worry, stood by a large wooden table, staring down at a series of documents spread across it. "Father," Zara said, stepping into the room. Her voice was steady, but there was a vulnerability there that Ethan hadn't noticed before. "What's happening?" The king looked up at his daughter, his expression one of both pride and concern. "The rebels have infiltrated the palace, but they haven't reached us here yet. We don't have much time." Ethan's eyes narrowed. The king's words made it clear that the royal family was in immediate danger, and they had to act fast if they were going to survive. But there was more to it. The urgency in the air wasn't just about the attack. It was about the decision that had been made in the heat of the moment. Ethan could see the weight of that decision on the king's face. "You'll marry," the king repeated, his voice firm. "It's the only way to protect my daughter. The Zorvani people will accept you as their king-in-law, Ethan, and the rebels will have no reason to challenge our rule. They'll think you're loyal to the throne." Ethan shook his head. "I'm a soldier. I'm not a king, and I'm definitely not ready for this." The king's eyes softened, but his tone remained resolute. "None of us are ready. But sometimes, life doesn't give us the luxury of preparation. Your marriage to Zara will unite our people. It will show them that the royal family remains strong. And it will give us the protection we need." Ethan was silent for a moment, processing the gravity of the situation. He had never been one for politics or royal affairs. He had always believed in protecting the innocent, in fighting for a cause that was just. But this was different. He wasn't just protecting a kingdom. He was now bound to a woman, a princess, who had her own burdens to carry. He had no idea what he was getting into. But then he looked at Zara, standing beside him. Her face was calm, but her eyes told a different story. She was scared. He could see it in the way she clenched her jaw, the way her hands fidgeted with the edges of her dress. She wasn't just being forced into a marriage for political reasons. She was being asked to trust a man she barely knew with the rest of her life. And that trust was something Ethan didn't take lightly. "Zara," he said, his voice softer now, "you don't have to do this. There's another way. We can fight the rebels together." She shook her head, her eyes hardening. "The rebels are already inside the palace, Ethan."
"We're running out of time. My father's right. We don't have another choice."
For a moment, the room was filled with silence. The weight of the decision hung between them like a heavy shroud. Ethan wasn't sure if he could do this, if he could marry someone he had just met, someone who was now depending on him to protect her and her people. But he knew one thing for sure. He couldn't walk away. Not now. Not when she needed him the most. "I'll protect you," he promised, his voice steady.
"I'll do whatever it takes."
Zara gave him a faint smile, but it was one filled with gratitude and resignation.
"I know you will." The ceremony was hastily arranged.
There was no time for elaborate celebrations or preparations. The royal guards were stationed outside the chamber, ensuring that no one interrupted the private proceedings. The king himself presided over the ceremony, his face grim as he spoke the words that would bind Ethan and Zara together in marriage. Ethan stood before the king, his mind reeling. He had never imagined that his life would take such a turn. But as Zara's hand was placed in his, he realized that this was no longer just about survival. It was about something more. They were in this together now. They would face the challenges ahead side by side. As the ceremony came to a close, the king's voice echoed in the room once more. "You are now bound, not only by marriage, but by duty. Protect my daughter, Ethan. The fate of our people rests in your hands." Ethan nodded, the weight of the responsibility settling on his shoulders. He had never signed up for anything like this, but as the king's words resonated in his mind, he understood the truth. He wasn't just fighting for his life anymore. He was fighting for the future of an entire world and for the woman who had just become his wife. The days that followed the rushed wedding were a blur of political discussions, military strategy, and unspoken tension. Ethan had never imagined that his life would take such a dramatic turn, but now he found himself bound to a princess of an alien kingdom, tasked with protecting her from enemies he barely understood. The palace was no longer the peaceful sanctuary it had once been. The walls, once filled with laughter and music, now echoed with the sounds of hurried footsteps and quiet conversations. The royal family, now under constant threat from the rebels, had become a fortress. Every guard was on high alert, every movement monitored. Ethan, despite being newly married to Princess Zara, found himself thrust into the world of Zorvani politics with little more than the training he had from Earth. Zara, ever the stoic princess, kept her emotions carefully hidden. Ethan could tell that the weight of the rebellion was taking its toll on her, even though she rarely showed it. She moved with grace and confidence, but her eyes, when she thought no one was looking, held a sadness that seemed to never leave her. Her people were on the brink of war, and her father's health was deteriorating under the pressure. She had been forced into a marriage with a stranger, and now her world was changing faster than she could keep up with. Ethan, for his part, had thrown himself into the role of protector. He spent long hours with the royal guards, learning about the Zorvani military tactics and weapons. He was a soldier, after all, and if he was going to be part of this world, he needed to know how to fight for it. But there was a constant undercurrent of doubt running through his mind. He had never been a politician. He had never been part of a royal family, and he had certainly never been married to someone he had just met, let alone a woman who was now the key to the future of an entire planet. The morning after their wedding, Ethan had woken to find Zara already gone. She had a routine, he quickly learned, a series of duties that kept her busy from sunrise to sunset. She met with advisors, coordinated with the military, and reviewed intelligence reports from all corners of her kingdom. There was no time for rest, no time for relaxation. Even their wedding night had been interrupted by a late-night meeting with her father's generals. The palace, though magnificent, felt increasingly like a prison. The guards watched every move with suspicion. The guests who had once filled the halls with laughter now avoided eye contact, as though the wedding itself had been tainted by the rebellion. The other noble families who had once looked upon Zara as a future queen now saw her as a symbol of weakness. Some of them had already begun whispering about her marriage to a human, questioning whether it was the right decision. They were frightened, uncertain, and in many ways, they were right to be. Zara had told Ethan little about the details of the rebellion, but the more he listened to the conversations around him, the more he pieced together. The Zorvani people were divided. There were factions that wanted to maintain the status quo, loyal to the king and the royal family. But there were others, especially among the younger generations, who felt that the monarchy had grown stale, that it was time for a change. The rebels, though disorganized, had supporters within the palace walls. They were waiting for the right moment to strike, and that moment, Ethan feared, was rapidly approaching. He found Zara in the palace garden late one evening, standing alone in the soft light of the twin moons. She had always been a creature of grace, but tonight she seemed more fragile than usual, as if the weight of everything pressing on her shoulders had finally begun to show. "Zara!" Ethan called softly, approaching her from behind. She turned, her expression a mix of surprise and something deeper, perhaps relief. She seemed to be glad of the company, even if she didn't show it openly. "Captain Ward," she said, the formal title slipping from her lips with the same ease it had the first time they met. "What brings you out here?" Ethan paused, unsure of how to respond. They were still strangers in many ways, their marriage more a matter of necessity than love. But that didn't change the fact that they were now bound together, and something about Zara's vulnerability pulled at him. He had promised to protect her, and he intended to keep that promise, no matter what. "You look like you could use some company," Ethan said after a moment. His voice was soft, but there was strength in it. "You've been carrying a lot. Maybe it's time for you to share some of that weight." Zara's lips twitched upward, but the smile never reached her eyes. "I don't have time for distractions, Ethan. My people are in danger. My father's health is failing. My people. And there's a war brewing on the horizon." Ethan took a step closer, close enough to see the fine details of her face, her eyes, the way the light caught her skin, the way her hair framed her face. There was something so human about her, something that made him forget, just for a second, that she was an alien princess, and he was nothing more than a soldier thrust into this world. "Then let me help," Ethan said, his voice firm. "I may not be Zorvani, but I know how to fight, and I'll do whatever it takes to protect you." Zara met his gaze, her eyes dark with the weight of unspoken thoughts. She didn't speak for a long time, and for a moment Ethan wondered if she would brush him off, as she had done with so many others. But finally, she spoke. "I'm not sure how much longer my father can hold on," she said quietly. "The rebellion grows stronger every day. His health is weakening, and the people are losing faith in him. They need a leader, someone they can rally behind. But I can't lead them. Not like this." Her voice cracked slightly, betraying the vulnerability she had so carefully concealed. For a brief moment, Ethan saw past the mask of royalty, the princess who never let anyone see her fear. He saw a young woman burdened with more than she could carry, struggling to find a way forward in a world that seemed determined to crush her. "You don't have to do this alone," Ethan said, his voice soft but insistent. "We're in this together now. I'm not going anywhere. You can count on me." Zara's gaze softened, and for the first time since they had met, she seemed to relax just a little. Her shoulders lowered, the tension easing ever so slightly, but even in that small moment of vulnerability, there was still a weight to her eyes, a quiet sadness that wouldn't go away. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I don't know what to do anymore." Ethan reached out, placing a reassuring hand on her shoulder. We'll figure it out. Together. The quiet of the garden was interrupted by the sound of footsteps approaching. The moment was broken, and Zara straightened immediately, putting on her royal mask once more. Ethan stepped back, giving her space. We'll need to act soon, Zara said, her voice once again firm and composed. The rebellion is gaining momentum. My father's advisors are already talking about possible solutions. We have to be prepared for whatever comes next.
Ethan nodded, his mind already racing through possible strategies. The battle ahead would not be easy.
It would require everything he had. But more than that, it would require Zara to trust him, and for him to trust her. As they turned to walk back toward the palace, Ethan couldn't help but feel a sense of resolve settle within him. The future of this planet, of the Zorvani people, rested not just on his ability to fight, but on his ability to stand by Zara. She wasn't just a princess, and he wasn't just a soldier. Together they would have to find a way through this, or else everything would be lost. The tension in the palace had reached its peak. It had been days since Ethan and Zara had exchanged their vows, and yet neither of them had fully adjusted to the weight of the situation. The once pristine halls of the royal palace now felt more like a battlefield. The rebels were closing in, and the royal family was desperate for a solution. Ethan had spent the last few days training with the Zorvani military, learning their strategies and ways of combat. Despite the advanced technology and impressive tactics, he couldn't help but feel that something was missing. He was used to fighting on Earth, where every battle felt personal. But here, on this alien planet, the stakes were higher. The fate of an entire world rested on the decisions they made in the coming days. Zara had become more distant in the past few days. She was still the composed and confident princess. But there was a quiet sadness in her eyes that Ethan couldn't ignore. The pressure of the rebellion, the weight of the crown she would one day wear, had taken its toll. And the marriage that had been forced upon her, though necessary, had only added to the burden. Ethan often found her alone in the palace gardens, staring out at the distant horizon, lost in thought. It was clear that she was struggling with the choices that had been made for her. Her life, once filled with potential and dreams of a different future, had been redirected by the rebellion and the demands of her father. I never asked for this, Zara had confessed to him one evening as they walked through the gardens. I didn't ask to be a pawn in this political game. But now I have no choice. Ethan had no answers to give. He couldn't promise her that everything would be okay. He couldn't even promise that they would win this war. All he could offer was his loyalty and his willingness to fight by her side. And, as he had told her before, he would keep that promise. The rebels had been steadily gaining ground, and there was little time left to prepare. Zara's father, the king, had become ill, his body weakened by the stress of the constant battles. His advisors were urging him to take a more aggressive stance, but the king, though still a powerful figure, had grown more withdrawn. The rebellion had drained him, and now his daughter would have to step up. Despite the challenges ahead, Zara had taken charge in the last few days, meeting with her father's generals and formulating a strategy. She was no longer the princess who had walked into that wedding hall with uncertainty in her eyes. Now she was a leader, strong, decisive, and ready to fight for her people. Ethan could see the change in her. There was a fire in her now, a determination that he hadn't seen before. She was no longer just the princess. She was the future of her people, and he knew that, no matter what, he would stand by her. The battle lines were drawn, and the palace was on high alert. The Zorvani royal family had become the target of the rebel forces, and there were whispers that the king might be forced to abdicate the throne. Ethan had heard rumors of a secret faction within the royal court, men and women who had once sworn loyalty to the king, but were now secretly working with the rebels. It was clear that the rebellion had its roots not just in the streets, but in the very heart of the palace itself. Ethan had no choice but to trust Zara, and for the first time since the wedding, he saw her as more than just a princess. She was a fighter, a leader, and someone who would stop at nothing to protect her people. The bond between them had grown stronger over the past few days, forged not just through their marriage, but through the shared understanding of the stakes they were facing. It was late one evening when Zara called for him. He found her in the war room, poring over maps and intelligence reports. Her face was lit by the soft glow of the holoscreens, her brow furrowed in concentration. "I need your help," she said without looking up. Her voice was calm, but there was an edge to it that told Ethan this was not a request. He stepped forward, examining the map in front of her. It was a detailed layout of the palace and the surrounding areas. "What's the plan?" he asked, already knowing that whatever came next would be dangerous. Zara's eyes met his, and for the first time, he saw the full weight of her responsibility in them. "We don't have the luxury of time anymore. The rebels will strike tonight. We need to act fast or they'll overrun the palace." Ethan nodded, his mind immediately shifting into soldier mode. "What do you need me to do?" "I'm not asking you to fight," Zara said quietly. "I need you to protect the king. He's too ill to defend himself, and the rebels know this. If they get to him, it's over. We can't afford to lose him." The gravity of her words sank in. The king was the last line of defense, the symbol of their kingdom. If he fell, the rebellion would have won. Zara was right. This was the most crucial task. Ethan had been prepared for battle, but protecting the king would be a different kind of fight, one that required strategy, patience, and trust. "Where is he?" Ethan asked. "His chambers are on the far side of the palace," Zara replied.
I'll go with you. I can't let anything happen to him."
Together, they made their way through the palace, moving quietly through the dimly lit corridors. The palace had never felt so empty, so silent. The usual bustle of servants and attendants had been replaced by tension and fear. Every corner felt like a potential danger, and every shadow seemed to hide a threat. When they reached the king's chambers, they found the doors ajar. The guards stationed outside were nowhere to be seen. Zara's face went pale, and Ethan's hand instinctively went to his weapon. They stepped inside, finding the king lying in his bed, his face ashen, his breathing shallow. Ethan rushed to the king's side, kneeling beside him. Zara stood at the foot of the bed, her hands clenched into fists at her sides. "Father," she whispered, her voice shaking, "you have to stay with us." The king's eyes flickered open, and he gazed up at his daughter with a weak smile.
"Zara,"
he rasped, his voice barely a whisper. "You've grown strong." "We don't have time for pleasantries, Father," Zara said urgently. "The rebels will be here soon. We need to get you out of here." The king shook his head, his expression solemn. "It's too late for me, but it's not too late for you, Zara. You are the future of this kingdom. You must stand strong." Ethan watched the exchange, his heart heavy. He knew that the king's words were not just advice, they were a final wish. The king was giving Zara the throne, knowing that he would not survive the rebellion. Zara's eyes welled with tears, but she quickly wiped them away, her face hardening with resolve.
"I won't let them take you, Father."
Ethan stood up, his voice steady. "We need to move, now." Together they carefully helped the king out of bed, supporting him as they made their way to a hidden escape route. They knew that the rebels were close and there was no time to waste. The king's life depended on their ability to stay one step ahead of the rebels. As they moved through the palace, the sound of distant explosions echoed in the distance. The rebellion had begun in earnest. There was no turning back now. When they finally reached the safe room, Zara turned to Ethan, her face a mixture of fear and determination. "We're not done yet," she said, her voice barely audible. "We still have to fight."
"We can't let this kingdom fall."
Ethan nodded. He had made a promise to protect her, and he would keep it. No matter what came next, he would stand by her side. The future of the Zorvani kingdom rested on their shoulders, and the war had only just begun.